Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. On February 3rd, President Trump signed an executive order to create a sovereign wealth fund. And for a lot of us, the first question is, what the heck is a sovereign wealth fund? The next question becomes, how does it work and really what's the point? A sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned investment fund that manages a country's financial assets to generate wealth for the future. Now, the key point here is that these funds are generally established using surpluses from government revenues, and these funds themselves tend to hold individual assets. Maybe it's stocks or bonds or real estate, and the idea is that long-term these funds generate an income and that they can help to cover future government expenses or future expenses coming down the road. Let's talk about some of these key features of a sovereign wealth fund. These funds are government-owned, they're managed by the government or the nation's central bank. They're generally looked at as long-term investments, so the assets in them are held for the long term with the idea of creating wealth over time. As an individual investor, we could think about it the way we look at brokerage accounts or employee-sponsored retirement plans. We hold assets within these accounts with the intent of holding them for the long term and generating wealth long term. And in a similar vein, thinking about the individual investor, these funds would be a diversified portfolio holding multiple different asset types. The idea here is to create economic stability, in that you have funds to draw on should a financial need arise. And importantly, they're funded by national wealth, most typically from budget surpluses or excess revenues. And I think that's a really key thing to focus in on, especially from the stance of the United States, because how would we fund this fund? The US currently has $36 trillion of debt, so we don't really have a surplus to speak of. There are many countries that have sovereign wealth funds. Countries like Norway and Saudi Arabia have these types of funds, which are funded by oil and gas revenues. China has one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, and it's funded through trade surpluses and foreign investments. These surpluses are generated because China tends to export more than it imports, and some of these profits are then directed to this fund, where they're put into investments, and long term they can help generate an income. Again, if we think about this on the personal level, rather than having your cash just sitting idly by in, say, a savings account, you invest it. You put that money to work, growing over time and hopefully generating an income. Within the US itself, we have a state-level wealth fund, the Alaska Permanent Fund. A portion of the money from oil extraction and sales is directed into this fund, where it then gets invested in a diversified portfolio that hopefully grows long term. And each year, a distribution from the fund is distributed to Alaskan residents. And the goal here is to help create economic stability for Alaskan residents. As of 2024, the fund holds over $80 billion in assets. It's run by the state, and historically speaking, residents have received an annual payout ranging from $1,000 to over $3,000 per person. The fund itself is not perfect. There's disagreement in how the money is managed, how it's shared between the government and the residents, but notably, there has been less childhood poverty in Alaska because of its distributions. So sovereign wealth funds absolutely exist, and they exist with varying degrees of success. And that brings us back to President Trump signing an executive order to create a US sovereign wealth fund, directing the Treasury and Commerce Department to lay out a plan of how this fund would function. And that brings us back to the glaring question of, is this even possible? With our nation's debt at $36 trillion and increasing on a regular basis, I think this brings up some really big and valid concerns about potential funding sources. We could consider that the government already owns assets. Those include land and infrastructure and patents, among many other things. Would they consider selling some of these assets as a way to fund this wealth fund? I would think that's highly doubtful, and even so, even if they did, that would just be a one-time funding source. It's possible that the government could divert a portion of current revenue streams to a newly established fund, maybe revenues from taxes or tariffs. But if we're diverting revenues that are already incoming to the government, it's going to result in cuts to other programs. Think Social Security, education programs, defense. So ultimately, that seems like a very risky maneuver. Of course, there's always the idea that a new tax could be levied, whether this is on financial transactions or certain goods or services that already exist within our economy, and a new tax would lead to new revenue streams. A new tax would likely be met with a lot of backlash, and if there were a new tax established, we have to question how much revenue could this tax actually generate, and it's also worth considering that more taxes can in the long term impede economic growth. President Trump did hint that TikTok could somehow be placed into this fund. No further details were offered on how that would work. This does kind of hint at seizing foreign assets, which would be very controversial, especially in a diplomatic stage. Another angle that could be leveraged is the US could issue bonds or debt. So investors could buy these bonds, giving money to the government that the government could then invest long term. But keep in mind that these bonds eventually have to be paid back, and the US already has really excessive debt levels. And yes, while President Trump is the one making headlines by signing an executive order to look into creating a sovereign wealth fund, when President Biden was in office, he too explored the concept of developing a sovereign wealth fund. And even though we've had presidents from opposing political parties express a shared interest in a sovereign wealth fund, the reaction from the public has been largely negative. One of the biggest concerns surrounding developing one of these funds is the potential misuse of these funds, and these concerns aren't unfounded, as Malaysia had a sovereign fund that had one of the most infamous cases of corruption, where billions of dollars were funneled into personal accounts of government officials, which they then used to buy luxury goods, luxury homes, and even a yacht. We're already in an environment where there's a lot of mistrust between politics and government, so I don't really think these concerns are baseless. Redundancy is another strong argument. The US already invests heavily in infrastructure and social programs and spends trillions of dollars on national projects within the federal budget. So would another fund just be adding another layer of complexity and yet another government program without any clear strategic purpose? I think this is a pretty strong argument. No matter what you see in the headlines, I think there are some key takeaways that we need to focus on. Any US sovereign wealth fund is clearly in the idea stage. There's no clear funding source and no plan for implementation, and largely public reaction has been negative. The idea of corruption, mismanagement of funds, and just simple redundancy. And keep in mind, our $36 trillion worth of debt are really going to impede any sort of implementation in this type of plan anytime soon. My personal thoughts, any idea of a US sovereign wealth fund are unlikely, impractical, and probably going to be met with a reality check. Our current national debt levels just don't seem to make it possible. There's no clear funding source. Also, consider our current political environment. There's a lot of dysfunction and a lot of conflict. So I think any idea that one of these funds would be established is really just wishful thinking. What are your thoughts? Share them in a comment down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. I swear that hair is going to be the death of me. This is why I don't film in the afternoon. Nope. It's hard to freestyle on this. I want to do it justice. Put some of my words, space them out, say the full word. Most important thing. That brings us back to President Trump. That's his name. I'm getting really nervous here. I have to pick up my son from daycare in 20 minutes, so I gotta do this. I can't. I think I need to go splash cold water on my face and start all over again. Directing fund. It should not be this hard. Treasury and Commerce Department. That was unnecessarily hard. The wind needs to stop. Shh. I don't know, and just simple redundancy. I think I'm just gonna mess up every step along the way. And I think that's how we're rolling today.